I'm going to introduce in a moment here Todd Pietri, to my collaborator with this conference and co-founder. We, when it comes to the topic of data and analytics, my partners know that I'm think of the Linda Ronstadt song, I've been cheated and mistreated. And, it's an area that's been frustrating to me for a long time. Last year in my remarks, I cited one of my companies, CodeWrite, which is a natural language processing technology aimed at decision support for coding. So it takes physician dictation and translates into the ICD-9, CPT-4 codes. And, they're up to 5 or 6 million notes a month, an incredible amount of data. And at one point we said, well, why don't, rather than, I likened it to catch and release fishing, rather than just sort of plucking the data out and coding it and throwing it back in, why don't we do something with it? And we created a product called Data Scout and went out to try and sell it. And, it was really an uphill battle. And we sold the company to 3M, closed about 2 months ago, so we'll see if they do better. It was a great investment success, although still without any material contribution from the data element. But the Data Scout product was a huge part of the valuation multiples they gave us. So I wish them the best of luck. So with that, and with an auspicious panel, I give you Todd Pietri.
Thank you, Brandon. We've enjoyed being an organizer and sponsor of this conference since the beginning last year. My name is Todd Pietri. I'm a co-founder and general partner of Milestone Venture Partners. Our firm, which is located in Midtown Manhattan, specializes in digital health and information services investments. We're excited about this panel because a number of our portfolio companies address the problems of big data, analytics, and data liquidity. And we're also excited about it because these topics are compelling investment areas. And so I want to give a little bit of background on the market and the opportunity before we turn to introductions and questions. So first off, what is big data? I think it's a fair question. And listening to Peter Levin's comments, the numbers he was throwing around are getting confusing, and so I think it does help to ground it. A big data set is a data set which is so large and dynamic that you cannot effectively capture, manage, and analyze it with conventional database technology like SQL Server or MySQL or even an Oracle database. So how big is a data set that's that big? Well, the definitions that I have read equate it to a few dozen terabytes up to a couple of petabytes. So how big is that? We saw some definitions earlier, and it does get confusing, but all the printed material in the Library of Congress would equate to about 20 terabytes. The typical 1,000-person employee company across all sectors on average would have 200 terabytes. But I think that this area is less about the data that you already have behind your firewalls, and it's really about the explosion of data sources outside the firewalls that you can interrogate for competitive advantage. So some examples of data sources that are now available with these new technologies and tools that you could interrogate include the Twitter fire hose. That's a huge data source. Facebook user data. Machine log file data, the geolocation data coming off of 5 billion cell phones, supply chain logistics data that your partners may want to share with you if it's a good deal for them. And then let's not forget of all the data that the U.S. government is making available. They have initiatives underway. They're also funding EHR databases with the HITECH Act and the $20 billion, $30 billion that we're spending on electronic health record databases. Now, there are many ways to process and analyze these large data sets, but just about all of them involve computing with massively parallel clusters of commodity hardware and non-relational databases. The inventor of this approach was really Google, because they had a very big problem. The problem was they needed to index all the web pages on the internet, and they needed to be able to return results for search queries simultaneously in real time. So you couldn't centralize that in an Oracle database and have it work. So they invented something called MapReduce, and they invented something called Google File System, which obviously works very well. A researcher at Yahoo said, we're going to do the same thing, but not only are we going to do it, we're going to open source it. And so they open sourced a software program called Hadoop. And Hadoop is really the technology that's making its way into the companies that are not Google, mere mortals, not as technologically advanced companies. And Hadoop is very good for unstructured data. But there are other technologies for structured data. And these are oftentimes known as next-generation data warehousing technologies. So companies like Aster, companies like Greenplum or Netezza are examples of next-generation data warehousing companies. And I mention those companies because they help us understand how dynamic the market is. All of those companies have been acquired. EMC acquired Greenplum. Teradata bought Aster. IBM bought Netezza. They paid $1.7 billion for that company, about 7 times revenue. And so a lot of companies are being acquired. In fact, IBM is committing $10 to $15 billion to buy up analytics companies because there's a big opportunity. And all of these companies are pointing to the healthcare use case and application as presenting huge opportunity. So one thing we're going to want to understand today is whether or not that's here or it's a long way from now. There are really interesting businesses, though, being built in data mining, in data integration, in data visualization, data integration. And one company that recently went public is a company called Splunk. It has less than $100 million of revenue. It went public recently. It has about a $3 billion market cap. So this is happening. Value is being created. One research firm estimates that the market right now is about $5 billion, growing 60% per year. So in a half dozen years, we could be at $50 billion if you believe this firm. And like all other great computing opportunities, the benefits will eventually get to healthcare. It's always slow. That's one reason why we like health information technology. You can see what's happening in other sectors. You can see it coming, and you can try to anticipate, how it's going to get to healthcare and when it's going to get to healthcare. McKinsey, in their Big Data Manifesto, which you can download off the internet, estimates that the U.S. healthcare system can save between $200 billion and $300 billion annually by adopting these kinds of technologies. But again, we'd like to stress test and figure out if that's true. And of course, the other topic, data liquidity, is equally important. And data liquidity is nothing more than the ease with which you get information from one organization or individual to those who need it. The health information exchange vendors are the companies that are at the vanguard studying this and working on it. We have a representative on the panel, so we're going to want to hear about it. But essentially, the problem is, how do you get information to where it resides, where it is often trapped, to those users, the clinicians, the hospitals, and above all, the patient, when you need it. And then you can make data-driven decisions. And so we're going to be very interested to hear about that. So with that, let's start with some introductions. Kevin, can you kick us off and tell us about your business? We'd like to understand what it is that you're doing.
Okay, yeah, thanks. My name is Kevin Leininger. I'm the CEO of a company called Integrichain. And we come at this with a little different lens than a lot of the perspectives we've been listening to do. And today, we run a cloud. We like to use cloud because we get higher multiples, by the way. That's the primary difference between that and a data center, by the way. For you investors in the room, use cloud. Anyway, we do run two very large data centers today where we're processing about half of all the U.S. channel transactions in pharma. So today, we have 7 of the top 10 global pharmas, and I guess it's now about 18 of the top 30 pharma companies that transmit data daily from their channel. They're wholesalers, they're retailers, they're specialty distributors, they're specialty pharmacy companies and providers into our data centers. We process all of that data, we enrich it, and we put it in everything we do is in memory. So we're actually dealing with real new in-memory technologies and columnar technologies to process that data at blinding speeds and give them back that data in near real time. So it's 100% visibility to the channel in pharma with a 3-hour lag. So if you can think about that's revolutionary in pharma because the earlier comment around oligarchy was, I would argue, a little bit incorrect around the syndicators. It's actually called a monopoly, and that's IMS. And the way IMS has functioned for 30 plus years is it's bought data from the channel, it's processed that data, and it's sold that data back to pharma manufacturers and other participants in the channel. What's happening now is that there's all kinds of data flooding in from the channel directly to the manufacturers due to a variety of contracting terms they've constructed and so forth. So much of the data that has historically been purchased by the syndicators and processed and given back in is now coming directly to the manufacturers. Paradoxically, however, they're cutting IT staffs as fast as they can because as you all well know, they're losing $35 billion of the patented product in 2012 in a $300 billion market. So it's a bloodbath in pharma in 2012. So you've got this problem where all this data is coming in now, yet there's less and less capacity to process it. So what they've decided to do en masse is move that data into a very highly secure cloud that they audit very, very carefully with our customers. And we process all that data, enrich it, and give it back to them to do a variety of functions, from better sales forecasting, actually calling on points of care, we call them, pharmacies, hospitals, things like that, doing better financial planning, doing better production planning. Actually, in several like GSK, and this is public information, Galderma, Gilead have launched pharmacy field sales forces. I heard the pharmacy earlier. They're using our data, and it's actually their data, to drive a lot of that work and drive compensation and the management of that whole process.
Thank you. Mansoor?
Sure. Thank you. So Mansoor Khan, I'm the CEO of DiagnosisOne and one of the founders. So we are sort of in the spot that Peter mentioned in the previous keynote address, where we live in the clinical data stream. We take what we thought was going to be not too much data. When we first started out, the data that we get is clinical data, and we expected it to be in chunks of 20 to 50 kilobytes. We allowed for 500 kilobytes. When we went live, we found we're getting 20 megabyte chunks. So we had to literally, in weeks, move our systems from expecting a certain amount of data to going 2 orders of magnitude higher than that. But fundamentally, we are in the business of taking data and converting it into actionable information. So we are a web solution, a web services-based SaaS solution that sits behind EHRs, HIEs, hospital information systems, laboratory information systems, what have you. We look at the flow of clinical data, identify clinical events that may be of interest either for individual patients or on a population basis, and then in real time generate alerts, typically in hundreds of milliseconds sorts of response time. So something happens in a hospital, an ambulatory environment, a lab result comes into a physician's office somewhere. We're watching for that, identify that, generate an alert, and send that in real time back to somebody who needs to respond to that. That's fundamentally the business we're in. The surprise for us was the volumes we're dealing with. So we're finding that if we just look at the quality-related data, leaving aside, there's about 8 other categories we could look at, but if you just look at the quality-related data, we are generating approximately 80 gigabytes per physician per year of data. So you run those numbers and you start looking at thousands of physicians, and then you say how many years do you need to maintain that data for a patient? You end up into many, many terabytes very, very quickly. And all of that has to be managed in real time as it's coming in, because responses are literally 200 to 300 millisecond sorts of time frame. That's the world we live in. Attached to that, one of the world's largest databases of what's called evidence-based knowledge, which is used as the expert knowledge to evaluate the data, to convert it into actionable information, and you create a very, very interesting scenario, which is just now really coming to the forefront as EHRs multiply across the nation, but which is going to be very, very critical as both the data and the availability of these systems at the point of care grows.
Robert. And I'm Robert Connolly, Senior Vice President of an HIE company. I heard this morning the largest in the nation, so that's pretty good. Medicity, we were acquired by Aetna about 1.5 years ago. Prior to that, I was with McKesson. I was the VP of Technology, or their Chief Mad Scientist, I guess was my term. And what I work on is the other end of the spectrum, where we talk about big data and how it's coming together in multi-tera petabytes of information. We're really focused on, I'll almost call it my job, plumbing, because we have to connect these systems together and pull this data out. And I use the plumbing metaphor, actually it's more realistic than you might imagine, because what these systems output, there are words for. As Peter described earlier, we talk about different formats. It's not just the different formats, it's different meanings of the same word. I worked years ago in a Midwestern city, and the 2 doctors were talking about standardization. And they were saying, we can't standardize on what a red X on a surgical patient means. Does that mean cut or not cut? So standards are one of the things that we work with. Interoperability are one of those places that we sort of live in the real world. And the reality is that not everybody's connected. This is a process that's been going on for 20, 30 years in my experience, and continues to go on. We're seeing great strides in standards. We're seeing great strides in technology, Moore's Law and things like that may help us deal with these large, massive amounts of data. But the reality is data in one place is being copied in many other places. So that net effect of data aggregation is going to be significantly large. And for companies like Intel and others, I imagine it's going to be a great thing. But what we still are focused on here at this level is how do you get people to use the systems that collect this data and start using it on a day-to-day basis? And this is probably some of the biggest challenges that we run into, is the fact that you stand up an EHR in a practice and the nurses start using it. Doctors may come a year or two later when they start using the system. So they're partially used. And then the workflow becomes a big issue that we're starting to realize is where the rubber hits the road in a certain extent. For example, we've talked about the advances in analytics, the advances in technology. Still, all the studies show the best way to keep a patient from being readmitted to the hospital within 30 days is a phone call from the nurse within 7 days of the discharge. That, by orders of magnitude, is a more important thing to do. So we're trying to bring this notion of data analytics and liquidity to the point that it actually is helping people in their day-to-day jobs. And how do they see gaps in care where a patient may fall through the cracks in an exchange? Maybe it's a referral, maybe it's a transfer from one location to the other. These sorts of systems coming into play, which are transforming a lot of the data formats so that Mansoor, Kevin, and others can take advantage of this data and start doing their magic with it. So I'm afraid we're more at the lower level right now, but we hope to enable some of this magic in the future.
Thank you. Just for those that who don't know, Aetna paid $500 million. That's $500 million, Dwayne, for Robert's business, Medicity.
They got a bargain.
Which gave hope to venture capitalists and entrepreneurs everywhere. So thank you for that. So starting with you, Mansoor, what data sources are available to you today that you're using? Tell us about those, but then also tell us about the data sources that you want to incorporate but you have not yet gotten to that are exciting and compelling.
Sure. So this industry, our space, has traditionally lived on claims data. So the entire 98% of the analytics vendors out there have lived on collecting claim data, typically 30 to 90 days after a patient encounter has happened, analyzing it with some set of rules, initially many proprietary, now more evidence-based, but some set of rules, and then generating analytics, et cetera, that would go back to a case manager or some non-physician, non-nurse sort of care provider. The future is all about clinical data. So how do we take clinical data and do it as close to real time as we possibly can so that we can impact the care of the patient right when the care is happening? So we don't want to wait 30 days or 90 days when most of this, what would have been achievable, has already been cast in stone and there's very little you can do. You want to get to it in some cases before the patient actually gets there, but at least in most cases as soon as that data is available or as soon as the interaction happens. So we currently live on working behind the EHR. So we sit behind the EHRs, the HIEs, the hospital information systems, as I mentioned, and we look at the clinical data typically in the form of something that's called a CCD, a continuity of care document, which is sort of becoming the standard for interchange. Although, as somebody once said, the good thing about standards is that we have so many of them. So, you've seen a CCD, you've seen a CCD. But over time, it will improve. Our ability to take different flavors of it and rationalize them is improving. The EHR's ability to generate standard CCDs is improving. So over the next few years, that barrier is going to become lower and lower. But that's where we are getting the data from today. What we're doing now is going sort of one step back and starting to incorporate claims data into that clinical feed to create a true longitudinal record that'll span not just what's known to an individual EHRs until systems like Medicity become pretty much ubiquitous. We still have the issue that an EHR only knows what that doctor knew about the patient. What might have happened in other facilities or other environments is not known to the typical EHR, so it's not known to us until we look at other data sources. So clinical data, claims data is sort of the next thing, which is already we're starting working on. And then, of course, the whole concept of the genomic data, although nobody really knows how to use it, that's going to be a key. But I think before that will be sort of some of the lifestyle sorts of information that's available. It's not available to us yet, but it certainly is out there, right? So where are people shopping? Are they joining health clubs? Are they driving? How much are they driving? What kind of job they have? That sort of data can also help inform a care provider into what sorts of actions they should be taking. So I think that's one of the key frontiers over the next couple of years is how do we get non-clinical data incorporated into the clinical data so you get a picture of the patient that's more holistic, that relates to not just what the physician did or what the healthcare system did, but what their life is like outside of the doctor's office, which is where 99% of our time time is spent.
Kevin, you operate in a different sphere
Right.
in pharma and supply chain, so why don't you answer the same question? What are your data sources? What do you want to get
Sure.
to that you can't get to? What's the future?
Yeah, so the data we get, of course, we get as a consequence of the manufacturer. So the manufacturer either bounces the data to us on their edges, or we get them directly from the channel, depending on what the manufacturer wants to do. It comes in a series of parts. The first data set we get is inventory data. So 180 distribution centers around the United States, give or take. Every day, those data centers are transmitting information to our data centers on inventory information and gross aggregate sales into the channel. The second piece of information we get are sales data. So every single sales transaction in the United States down into the channel, be it a hospital, a pharmacy, a doctor's office, whatever we see. So that comes into our data centers also every day. So that's today we're about 50% of all transactions in the US are flowing through our data centers. So the third piece of data we get is the ex-factory data, which is the data out of SAP. So every one of our manufacturer customers gives us their SAP data. So we take that in and we use that to triangulate everything else that's going out into the channel. So we do that, so we literally have an end-to-end 100% visibility from the time that product leaves the manufacturer until it is sitting at a pharmacy or a clinic or a hospital. Future data sets are very interesting because we now have just got into point-of-sale data. So we're now taking aggregated point-of-sale data and integrating that in. So now what you can imagine is I not only see the sell-in to a particular, let's say, pharmacy or hospital or clinic, I see the sell-out. So that becomes very, very interesting because now I have a very, very accurate sense of what's going on with the inventories in the channel. And one of the things that really shocked me about pharma when we really started doing this about 5 years ago was when we would go in and we'd start to look at this data and we'd talk to people in pharma, they'd say, well, you know where our products are? And I'd say, well, yeah. And they said, well, we have no idea. So it's really quite surprising. And they actually don't know who they sold it to either. It's really amazing. If you look at the commercial model for pharma for 25 years, it's really, really very simple. It's get doctors to write scripts, right? That's how they sold, that's how they thought, that's how they operated, and the rest is pull through, right? Well, the good news for a lot of the participants in here is that suddenly the channel matters, right? Payers matter, therapeutic interchange, switch, generics, all that stuff is going on. So we're starting to see a lot more point of sale data, but also I would say what's interesting is this is a very US-centric conversation here. Interestingly enough, this is a very unique market. I'm sure all of you know that. If you go to China, you know what they use to run their data today? Channel data. There is essentially no syndicated data. IMS has a product called Midas, but it's woeful. And there is no infrastructure there. And of course, you don't get doctor script information in China. So the next frontier for Integrichain is going to be going and helping our customers like Janssen and BMS and Merck and those folks to do this on a global scale and truly build a global platform for monitoring real-time flows around the world.
Actually, Kevin, if I may.
Go ahead, sure.
So as I was listening to the pharma panel
Can he
before,
ask a question like that?
You can ask a question. That's totally.
I was specifically told to ask a
Prepared for
question.
that. Wow.
So I heard you describe the chain all the way from the manufacturer, but you kind of stop at the pharmacy. And I'm looking
Right.
at the data we're collecting and the information we have about what's going on with the patient, which is kind of the next leg of that, right? So going back to the pharmacy sort of discussion we had earlier is we start connecting those
Right.
data points and we start looking at saying, okay, what's happening to the patient, which patients need this, when do they need it, and then connect back into your chain.
Yeah.
How does that add?
Well, I think it's something we should explore because everybody here knows that the U.S. market in particular is under pretty radical transformation. This has been a small molecule pill blockbuster industry, right? There's $80 billion drugs 5 years ago, right? Today they're a lot less. So if you talk to senior executives in pharma, they have two growth vectors, right? The first is specialty products. So oral, injectables and infused products, oncology, rheumatoid arthritis, and all that. Now you're moving from the pharmacy benefit, right, to the medical benefit and all that, which I'm not an expert in, but people here are. But what's most interesting about that is when you look at the channel data itself, one of the great blind spots has been around that retail stuff. Because if you go to IMS and you buy retail data, you actually get the doctor. You don't get the pharmacy, right? Because again, they haven't cared about the pharmacy. That's changing, but historically they haven't cared in pharma, at least for about 30 years. They used to call them pharmacies, but they haven't for about 30 years. And so what's really interesting is if you take a look at, we see within 3 hours of a drug going to a hospital, I see it. I know where it went, I know what class of trade it was sold on, I know what its chargeback was, I know what its contract information was. So, and if it's a direct ship from the manufacturer, I see it in the ex-factory. I see that within 3 hours as well. So I can literally, and so one of the things we've said is at some point down the road, we need to take that last local loop, if you will, and start to integrate it together. Because to be fair, what we don't necessarily understand very well is causation, right? In other words, if I see products going in, I'm not necessarily historically saying, well, what caused that, right? So the ability to integrate some of that kind of information could I think, allow us to do some analytical work that looks at not just correlation, but causation. And I think that'd be very powerful for pharma.
Nice. Robert, tell us about your customers. How are you creating value for your customers?
Well, we look at our customers as primarily the providers that Medicity has traditionally sold to, hospitals and the physician community. They have similar problems. It sounds like they're probably at the same level of pharmacies, not knowing the data about their customers as well. Typically, the big question about what's the most valuable thing in an EHR, and it's the data that's not in there, the data that's being created by other providers across the community, and that's where we're seeing large gaps. In the world of the providers, it's not about the quantity of data, it's more about the quality of data. They tend to want to filter it down and not see longitudinal records. They want to see the last 6 months of everything that went on with that patient. They may want to take drugs back in time to see patterns and things like that, but for the most part, they're sort of practicing in the here and now. So we see it as a matter of making sure that we can sort of create a coherent picture of data around a person at the right place and time. So with a provider needing to make a decision on a patient, maybe it's a diagnosis decision, oftentimes today these involve multiple specialties, multiple referrals just to get a diagnosis out, and then treatments to get even more complicated. So what we're finding is that the data picture needs to be perhaps a little bit smaller but more qualified around that person, that patient that they're working with, which leads into every subject we talked about today, from the patient engagement side, which that may be fine, but half the time the patients are the elderly that don't understand it, so you're having to bring in their care navigator, their young daughter, or somebody in the family that's having to manage that sort of care. And we're also moving more into data types. We tend to talk here in terms of clinical data, financial data, but what we're seeing more often than not, and I believe Dr. Hudson's going to be up here later talking about another company in our group, that looks at event-driven data. This is becoming even more popular now than some of the basic data that we can do analytics on. When was a patient scheduled? Did they have a referral made? What we're finding is that people are trying to intercede to make sure that these events take place, because we know that drives quality of care and cost phenomenally. If people just don't go to referral to a cardiologist, it's probably not a good thing. When they show up in the ED 2 weeks later, nobody knows it's happened. So we're going to get into situations like that. But that's what we sort of focus on there, is the movement of data to make sure we can paint the right picture at the right time, giving them the tools that they can collaborate better, then ultimately feed up to all of these systems that we're talking about here, because this is where it's generated. We talk a lot about cloud computing, and it's a great new term. It's been like 4 terms in my career. I'm not sure about everybody else here, but it's the same thing. But the reality in healthcare data, it's a brick and mortar world. I mean, we don't have much data in the cloud except for what we extract out. It originates down here in a hospital or in a practice somewhere, usually in a brick and mortar system. Well, how do you bring the cloud to the brick and mortar reality that we're in today? And that's where we find ourselves stuck. So terms like interoperability become enormously, power. In fact, I'll just change it just to operability. They're not aware of, computers are not self-aware of each other. They just don't have that capability. But they do operate, and they do send data out, and other middleware systems picks it up and moves it across, and we spend all of our time there, it seems like.
So if I could make one comment to expand on that, because if you think about it, if you took what you know and you gave it to me, right, I can real-time sense demand changes, right? Because one of the problems pharma has is it's woeful at understanding changes in demand because of the latency in script data, typically 4 to 6 weeks. Now, you can buy weekly data, but it's heavily projected, and then they restate it because they can't process the data fast enough. So what happens, right, is you've got this sort of moving target, right, and you're trying to understand, well, okay, X-Factory sales were down last week, so the finance guys are calling the trade people, and they're saying, what the hell's going on, right? Did something happen? Did we lose a payer? Did somebody die in the social media world from our product and we don't know about it? I mean, what's causing that change? Well, it could be that inventories are just getting burned down a little bit, right? And so this whole, the ability to sense demand changes in the market's been huge, because what's happening now is as you're moving away from this small molecule, big pill, blockbuster, Plavix, Lipitor, this is a pretty easy business to run. And no excuse to the Pfizer, to Wendy here, but this is a business that bumped along. It's massive, right? So you've got 15, 16, 18 days on hand of inventory in a channel, and you're just bumping along. And if it moves up and down a little bit, nobody cares. You talk about Yervoy from Bristol Myers. It's a $120,000 cancer drug, right? 4 injections of $30,000 a drug. Okay, you want to talk about cost inefficiencies, you better have that product in the right place at the right time, prescribed in the right way. Because if you don't, and you have a stock out, it's not like I couldn't go get my, even my cholesterol pill, I could probably miss it for a day, right? Knock on wood, right? But if I go to get my infusion and the product's not there, it's a huge problem. And so what happens is these much smaller orphan type products, tremendous amount of volatility in the channel, huge inefficiencies in the channel. So the more that we can tie essentially the movement of product information that we have with a better sense of what's driving that demand, the better off this channel will be. And actually, ironically enough, historically, pharma and the payers have butted heads. Pharmas and the wholesalers, this, have butted heads. It's been a sort of a love-hate relationship in a lot of ways. Interestingly enough, getting the right product to the right place at the right time benefits everyone. Benefits the patient, benefits the payer, benefits the manufacturer, benefits the wholesaler, benefits everybody. And so the more we can do that, the better we are.
And in many ways, analytics becomes a product like that. In fact, what we're sort of moving toward is a closed-loop data flow that works between these things from the time it's captured to help the people that initiate data capture and flow, usually providers and whatnot, till it's moved to the next segment that payers are evaluating for efficiencies and their things, and it's moved to analytics for gaps in care, and quite frankly, educating providers. I mean, most providers didn't go to school in the age that we live in now. In fact, most medical information has been recorded since long after they graduated, I'm afraid. So and then that's fed back to the point of care. That's really the vision that I think all of us share, is that this conglomeration of technologies and processes and resources start creating this loop so that we are bringing better power to the patient at that moment. And then after they leave, this never stops. This is where the HIEs are going. This is where the EHRs are going. This is where all of us here, I believe, are going. And it's a big boat. So a lot of opportunities.
So tell us about your smartest customers. What separates your really smart customers who are doing innovative things with data and those that are laggards? I mean, healthcare is full of laggards, but there are certain customers that have a different culture or different leadership or a different approach to data that must enable them to gain competitive advantage. What are they like? You can explain it.
Well, I can give you my 2 cents, and you said it. It's actually leadership. I think that, there's a sort of there's a tectonic shift in technology underway, right? And I think most of us recognize that, right? And it's all about the ability to analyze huge amounts of data quickly. I was just up in my room. We just released on our staging system, we just released a new set of our software. And I literally just queried 1 billion transactions. And I got a result back of about 40 million rows in about 30 seconds. And I pivoted in 3 seconds. 30 million transactions, 3 seconds. I mean, and that's not because, we're some brilliant guys. We're leveraging in-memory technologies and all this kind of crazy stuff. I guess we do have some pretty smart guys in my company. But what's interesting about that is once you start to have the ability to manage data like that, you can now manipulate it. We call it at the speed of thought, right? You can start to think about, right, well, geez, what if I thought about that by distribution center? Or what if I thought about that by payer? Or what if I thought about boom, boom, boom? And now you can see it. How does that work today? You go down to your IT group, you talk to them about building a Cognos cube on your Oracle warehouse, recent Fortune 500 study, 6 weeks to add a field to a typical report, 16 weeks to get a new report. By that time, I don't know about you guys, but after 6 weeks, I forgot my thought. Okay? Yeah. So the ability, and Steve Jobs was right. He said, at the end of the day, computers are just about managing zeros and ones. But if you do it fast enough, people think it's magic, right? And right now, we're starting to see some magic around this data. And what's really cool about that is that allows us to get all this data in one place and start to analyze it in ways that have never been possible before. But that takes leadership and that takes commitment, right? And some companies get it, some companies don't. That's always been my experience if you look at pharma.
So Robert, how many of your customers have that kind of leadership, the kind of savviness that allows them to take advantage of all this technology?
Well, probably the 80-20 rule, 20%.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we have very smart customers, although I think from our perspective, we're working with hospital systems and large HIEs, and I think I don't know if I'd call them the smartest ones, but I think the ones that are getting the best traction is we're down at that lower level where sort of the rubber hits the road. I mean, we're not just a data stream going to a database to be analyzed. We have to convince people to use computers. You go into a modern practice today that hadn't been using computers long, you're explaining what a mouse is to people. I mean, I swear you still are. And so what we have to do is get them to use it. And to do that, to create whatever behavioral change is involved, the smarter ones are basically leveraging technology as a great big carrot that says, let me show you how this is going to change your life. I'm not going to douse you with a fire hose. I'm not going to dunk you in the water. I'm going to let you tip your toe in there, and you're going to find value in this. And I'm going to gradually add more and more to it. But pretty soon, it's at your request. You're coming to me and asking for this technology. And our more successful customers take that approach, starting with their champions and gradually getting some sort of communal use, and then it becomes viral. And many of them can't keep up with the pace of implementation because now people are asking them to use it. And that's what starts the whole seed for all of this working. Biggest failure of technology is not the technology itself, it's the failure of adopting that technology and using it in a real world setting. And so that's what we're up against. And I think our smartest customers realize that. And so they're bringing their customers along, whether it be physicians and nurses or whether it be other environments altogether.
Are the payers more sophisticated than the health systems?
Well, they're more sophisticated in different ways and probably less sophisticated in others. But
with respect to this topic, are they investing more aggressively and trying to get the kind of personnel that you need to take advantage of it?
I'm probably evidence of that to a certain extent. Yes, they are. I mean, what I have seen thus far, the payer world, which now I'm part of, is that they are seeing great inroads. Of course, I work under Mark Bertolini, so that may be a different perspective altogether. But clearly, they're making great headway there. In our case, we have a massive IT operation, under the traditional Aetna insurance group that do phenomenal things. And what they're doing with us is they're sort of creating a standalone business that allows us to innovate more quickly in this ancillary world. It's not really directly related to what they do, although we are starting to cross over now and do a lot more payer-related things, uniting the clinical financial data, which is really where a lot of that comes from. And then as these narrow networks, as we like to call them, start forming, whether it's ACOs or PCMH or whatever, that these technology will be primed for that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the payers are actually probably a little bit a step ahead of where the providers are. The providers are treading water right now, just trying to manage through all this stuff, where the payers, I think, have the opportunity to really step beyond it and really lead right now. And we're starting to see that with ourselves and with United and others.
Do you agree with that, Mansoor?
Yeah, I think so. We have a channel model. So we sell to technology vendors who then sell to mostly to the provider space, physicians, hospitals, IPAs, etc. And to a certain extent, I think I have to mirror what Robert said, because what we're seeing is that our larger partners, larger customers who sell on the other end to the larger enterprises and therefore have more resources and more ability to have folks focused on R&D, etc., are the more advanced than some of the smaller players who are basically just, who on the other end are selling to small practices and are very, very cost conscious. Most of them are losing money hand over fist. So they're doing, the bare minimum they have to do to just keep going until somebody buys them out, sort of thing.
So all three of you guys are B2B in nature. Is there a chance to get this data into the hands of patients and empower them? Are any of you doing that, or is that on the roadmap for any of you?
So we do that today. We have so we offer sort of a spectrum of capabilities. One of those is patient education material. So we do provide that capability. We do it through the provider, however. So we provide the provider the information and the materials they need to educate the patient. We're not doing anything direct. We did do some stuff with Google Health Direct. We were the decision support system on Google Health, but as we know, that didn't really go very far. It kind of crashed and burned for various reasons. But there's been, once you get beyond the level of, say, a WebMD, much deeper than that, there's just so many issues with trying to expose consumers directly that it's something you have to be very careful with.
With privacy and security.
Privacy, liability, there's all kinds of issues that arise. If you're going through a provider, they're the final filter. They can decide whether this is something appropriate for the patient or not. And it solves a lot of problems, especially for a small company like us.
We're probably doing as much work in the consumer space as we are in the provider space.
I think
it's
that.
Probably fair to say across the company. Yeah, you'll be hearing from some of us later about some of that. What we focus on the HIE side is that bridge between consumer patient, their need for this information, which other technologies might provide, and then what we need to basically unlock or liquefy from these provider-based systems. Providers do interact with patients constantly. In fact, they share data constantly. It's just under different rules and just let's aggregate it and get it out as you will. It flows all the time. So if we can start capturing that and making sure it gets to the patients or the patient's navigator, which is probably even more important, that's where we think you really drive quality and costs down, because it's mostly people don't understand what to do. They don't follow their meds. They don't follow their instructions. They don't recognize these things. So that continual engagement with the patient and the consumer at that level is a huge thing for us. So we have entire groups that are focused on the consumer side of the world, including iTriage and others that have come to us for that purpose.
Great. Well, why don't we open it up to questions now and see if post-lunch anyone's interested in knowing a little bit more about data from the panelists.
There's a question over there. Huh?
Yeah.
I am Raj Lakhanpal from SpectraMD. This is for Robert. You have a lot of data from hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
What are business cases where the hospitals are willing to pay for that data could be leveraged?
The data itself?
Yeah.
To leverage the data?
To do analytics and to provide it back to the hospitals where they're saying, oh, okay, you're solving a problem and I'm willing to pay for it.
Some of it's going to be their need to advance from their own systems and what they have. They're going to have a need to aggregate data, get that insight from it, so that they know, better areas they might grow their business in is one area, and then in a competitive landscape that they're all in right now, that may offer them some better angles. I think many of them are using it not just for secondary use of the data, but more to attract more inbound business, by showing a better system, a better way of connecting everybody and showing everybody that same information. So if you're a doctor joining a health system, seeing that data, knowing that they have all this information about your patients means you're probably going to practice a little bit better, you're probably going to have better care. And then I believe opening up to analytics and looking for things like gaps in care, things that make the doctors' lives difficult, on a day-to-day basis. Because a lot of them are trying to take some of these easier diagnosed problems and use analytics to bring PAs and nurses into the fold and let them see more patients on a daily basis, which today is the model. So they seem to want to use it in that capacity. And I think that's probably the business that they're setting themselves up for. I mean, most hospitals out there are looking at some sort of narrow network business in the future. So prepping for this through the HIE technologies and the EHR technologies they seem to be driving. I don't know if they know the vision of what's going to happen when they get there, but they know they have to start setting these things up to be able to aggregate. The difference between an HIE aggregation versus an EHR aggregation is the HIE is available to others outside the four walls, whereas the EHRs are more internal and private. So having that ability shows that they are taking that step into the future with sharing and being able to take that next business step. And I think that's a great extent of what they're doing.
Another big area that they're looking at is provider management. So trying to figure out which are your high-cost physicians, after adjusting for risk, et cetera. But, where am I spending the money? Where are the patients going? Which providers are doing a good job? Which providers can improve? That's starting to be a big area, but in the future it's going to be huge, because as these systems take on risk, that's going to be a key driver of whether they make money or not in the final analysis.
Sure.
One point I wanted to mention, which kind of goes back a little bit into the discussion, but this was interesting, and I don't know how it relates to the FDA, but in ONC, in their latest certifications for stage 2 meaningful use of EHRs, actually sort of in a backhanded way allowed for sponsored content. So the concept that if Pharma or somebody could sponsor content that could be delivered to the point of care is allowed there, as long as it's identified as to who's sponsoring the content. And I would love to know if any of the Pharma guys have any thoughts on how the FDA reacts to that. But as far as ONC is concerned, that's now kosher use.
Yeah, because Pharma has a lot of data and a lot of knowledge about disease states and about patients, and if they could put that in the hands of those salespeople that Matt Wallach was talking about, rather than just pushing pills, they could push an information service that would create a new business model for Wendy's Group at Pfizer, and also diversify the revenue streams. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Jerry?
Yeah, I have a question about the difference between how much you're processing quantitative data versus, say, unstructured textual data. It sounded like a lot of what you had was supply chain data, which was quantitative, but how much are you guys, or are you aware of people doing unstructured data, starting to look at disease states, transitions, doctor's notes, things like that?
So we do quite a bit of that right now. Not so much into the doctor notes themselves, but certainly disease states, looking at previous diagnoses, looking at family history, looking at social history, looking at clinical events. What Robert was talking about, sort of the ability to process clinical events. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. That constitutes something that's of interest to me. So that's the capability that we have today that we're starting. The problem really is more on the incoming data. It's still not rich enough to really do that very well. But certainly I think over the next 4 or 5 years, that's going to be a quantum leap in the insights that can be derived from that sort of data.
We're starting to see it in specific areas a lot more. Office notes, not so much, but a pathology report is a good example of an unstructured document that you're going to have to do a lot with. It's almost semi-structured in the way it's organized. But you can't just rip through it and just do a map. It's got to be a little bit more involved with that. So with some of the systems we're working with, like in the oncology world, where a lot of the CDS systems are coming from, so that you can follow these protocols for cancer care, we have to interact with them by giving them discrete information out of a pathology report, as opposed to just feeding them the pathology text. So we're starting to get into that a little bit more. Ours tends to be still more discrete data that we are normalizing or standardizing.
Go ahead.
Zach Connely at Harvard gave a talk once, and he talked about the Vioxx spike that they saw once they aggregated a bunch of data from all their systems. So there's public health value and research value and all sorts of value to data in general. Do you guys have any plans to either make it public for researchers or the public in general, or partners who might want to analyze and give extra value to the kind of stuff that you guys have?
Yeah, so that goes to the ownership of the data, right? So fundamentally, providers basically act as if they own the data, and legally, I guess a lot of them do today. In our case, in some cases, we do have ownership of data. In many cases, we do not. The EHRs have data probably 30 or 40% of the time. They have the ability to do things with the data. 60% of the time, they don't. I don't know what your experience is, Robert.
Well, from the HIE, not so much, but from on the Aetna side, where we have some of our analytics groups that do this, I think I don't know the answer to the question, how they license or use that, but obviously those systems are well enough they can be depersonalized down to the level of giving you population-level data that's very instructive without being able to trace it back to an individual. I just don't know how we commercialize that, or if we do, but it's clearly there.
CMS actually recently had the big initiative to allow access to a lot of data. You had to pass through certain hoops before you could get it, and I think the window is closed now on applying for that. But they've certainly opened the door, and probably will open again.
Yeah, from our perspective, I think where there's great interest in that is around vaccines, right? Because I see vaccines data just like I see any other data, right? And places like the CDC and others will go to a company like GSK and say, if we had a pandemic, where's your product, right? And historically, pharma hasn't known. Particularly, you look at vaccines; they really don't know. Once that stuff leaves the dock, it's kind of a black box to pharma. And so, the ability to get good visibility downstream to things like vaccines is stuff that our pharma customers are talking to us about. How we can collaborate with the CDC and others, so that they make sure they've got stockpiles in the right spots and things like that. So, I think you'll see more and more of that.
Anyone else? Okay, well, we'll take a little break and move to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.